Welcome to Holy Post episode 466. When news broke a few weeks ago that the new president of the Southern Baptist had lifted portions of a message from the previous SBC president's sermon without attribution, hashtag Sermongate was born. We unpack the controversy, why so many pastors either outsource their sermon prep or flat out plagiarize, and why the pressure to preach is more proof that a sermon-centric church model may be flawed. Then, in a dramatic reversal, new data from the Pew organization says mainline churches are growing, while evangelical churches are shrinking. Have evangelicals been burned by their own critique that mainline churches don't take the Bible seriously? Or is the data just more proof that people are abandoning the evangelical label, even if they're staying at the same church? Then I talked to author and advocate Mary DeMuth, who explains the history of sexual abuse in the church, why cover-ups are now so common, how we can respond more redemptively, and the best ways to prevent the abuse in the first place. All of that, plus some good news from the science desk, where researchers report that we now have a backup breathing option if our lungs fail. Buckle up, everyone. It's time for the Holy Post.
Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer, and I am here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
And Kramer. Hi, Kramer.
Hi, Jerry.
Jason Rugg, who still has his Kramer hair on. Because it's humid in the desert. So
Yeah,
it really
very
gets
humid.
to your hair.
Yep.
Yeah, your hair just goes absolutely crazy. Skye, why are you looking at me like that?
Because the deserts are not humid. That's the very definition of a desert, is there's no moisture.
And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. Oh, Caitlin, it's so good to have you here. Is your mother nearby?
No,
No, she's out of the house, out of the country, out of town.
she is out of the house. Yeah, otherwise the door would be locked behind me because she
Oh,
really
yeah.
wants to interrupt
she
a
wants to
recording. And
Well,
yeah.
okay, this is for her, and she'll be excited to know because we haven't done this in a little bit of
no.
a while. It's time for the news of the butt.
And now it's time for news of the butt.
Scientists say mammals can breathe through their butts in emergencies. This just in. Good news. Hey, Skye,
Yeah,
I got a question for you.
yeah,
Are you a mammal?
I am.
Hey, boy, do I have good news for you. In an emergency, you can breathe through your butt. Even
What?
you, Skye Jitani, can. Do you need more info? Would you like more
Well,
info?
I'm trying to think of what
Yes.
would qualify as an emergency that would necessitate this.
Yes.
Scientists in Japan, this research is in from our Japanese News of the Butt desk. Scientists in Japan have demonstrated that mammals can absorb oxygen through the butt. I don't like the word anus. I don't like that word. It's an icky word, so I'm not going to say it. But it's not like
But you did.
It's
How
not
about
like
rectum?
Oh, I
Ooh.
don't like that word either. In the case of a medical emergency, researcher Ryo Okabe at the Tokyo, this is interesting, at the Tokyo Medical and Dental University.
Dental.
Yes, this research was done by a team of doctors and dentists working together. Okabe and a team from TMDU, go TMDU, the Fighting Dental Implements, experimented with mice, pigs, and rats by depriving the mammals of oxygen. Oh, that's always a fun way to start an experiment. Hey, don't let that thing breathe. And then essentially giving them oxygen-rich enemas in both liquid and gas form. Caitlin, you okay? Keep breathing. Caitlin.
Why?
Keep breathing to see what would happen. Why does all experimentation happen? Why?
Wait a minute.
Scientists
Wait a
never done
minute.
anything.
If I am in a location where I don't have enough oxygen to breathe, right, which
Yeah.
would be an emergency, why would there be enough oxygen available to go up my rear end? If there's enough to go up my rear end, why don't I just
'Cause-
open my mouth and breathe?
Because you brought your little emergency oxygen blaster capsule.
So put it in my mouth. That's my point.
Okabe and a team from TMDU experimented with mice, pigs, and rats by depriving the mammals of oxygen and then essentially giving them oxygen-rich enemas in both liquid and gas form. Both methods, liquid and gas form, succeeded in introducing oxygen to the animals' circulatory systems. With a little assistance, the mammals were essentially breathing through their butts.
All right. I have another question. If you can absorb oxygen through your butt,
Yes.
what else are we absorbing through our butts that we are unaware of right
No.
now?
Exactly. Good
Because
question.
I have a suspicion
huh?
there are
No.
things in my bloodstream that shouldn't be there.
Exactly. Inside
Why? No.
your bottom, inside your posterior, is a mesh of fine blood vessels just beneath the surface of the lining, which means that drugs administered through your back end are readily absorbed into the bloodstream. This made us wonder, says Ryo Okabe, whether oxygen could also be delivered into the bloodstream in the same way. So when would this be? What kind of emergency would this be helpful in? Can I tell you, Sky?
Yeah, when you've been buried up to your butt in the ground and you need to breathe.
No, really? A respiratory emergency. Like, say, you've got COVID and you can't get enough oxygen in your lungs.
Oh.
It is possible that rather than trying to find a ventilator or some other, like if you have a shortage of ventilators, they could take a different route
Yeah,
than your lungs.
yeah, a back road.
Yeah, so to speak, and it could save your life.
Okay, didn't we do a story a while
Sky?
ago about how you can spread COVID through farts?
Yes,
So,
but not if you're wearing pants, we established.
Yeah,
so
but how
what's
you
your
gonna-
point?
my point is there's a risk in
So-
going to that end also.
What? Well, not if your lungs are failing. What's the risk?
I don't know.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Sounds
This is
very
a
uncomfortable.
Dr. Caleb Kelly, a clinical fellow at Yale, not involved with the study because he found it disgusting, says this is a provocative idea and those first encountering it will express astonishment.
Yeah, the first time someone sticks a tube of oxygenated enema liquid up my butt, I'm going to be astonished too.
May I? I'd like to take this moment, Doctor, to express astonishment. Yeah!
I wonder if there's like, do you think athletes could use it this way, like for doping?
Oh, totally. Oh, yeah,
Like
yeah. When you're
to extra
you're short
oxygenate
of-
their
you're
blood.
short- yes. You go sit on the sideline on the special chair.
Mhm.
Go sit.
And you get an
Caleb?
oxygen infusion.
Caitlin?
I don't have anything to say.
Caitlin?
Yeah,
you
and when they
okay?
blow out their shorts on mile 27 or 23 of the marathon, they're just exhaling.
You've heard of the iron lung.
Yeah.
Get ready
and
for
you've
the
heard
iron
of
butt.
buns of steel. Okay. This has been the news of the butt.
This has been the news of the butt.
Sermongate prompts a quandary. Should pastors borrow words from one another? The new leader of the Southern Baptist Convention has delivered sermons containing passages from sermons of his predecessor, causing a fury. There's a fury because Pastor Litton, who's the new president of the SBC, has sermons that actually lifted stuff from Pastor J.D. Greer, the prior president of the SBC. And now that they've shaken hands and passed the baton and the gavel that was named after a slaveholder that they really don't want to use anymore. Now that they've done that, they're realizing, oh, wait, you ripped off my sermons. Well, this is awkward.
Don't they have a new gavel now?
Yeah, they started using a new gavel this year,
Okay.
but like just this year. It's
Yeah, no, still bad. Still bad. Yeah.
It's the Hobby Lobby Memorial Gavel.
Ooh.
Oh no! Did I do that? I'm so sorry. Scott, you wanted to talk about this story. What do you have to say about pastors? Because you got to preach every Sunday. You got to come up with stuff.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It is.
So you hear something really inspiring from another pastor, and you figure he would love it if this got out more, if this was shared more widely. So I'm helping him get his message out.
Okay, there are multiple layers to this that
Okay.
we could take some time to unpack. The most surfacey layer is simply the ethical, the unethical manner in which you pass off someone else's work as your own, right? Which is the definition of
Yeah.
plagiarism, right? So there's that level.
Yeah.
And actually that's a problem for sure, but it's not what bothers me most about this whole thing.
Okay.
What bothers me most is that, and this gets to my kind of why we need to move past a sermon-centric Sunday, but we have elevated the sermon as a form of performance art to sacramental levels in many evangelical churches, meaning it's the pastor and his or her delivery of a sermon through which I am primarily going to encounter God when I gather with other Christians to worship.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption behind that is that the pastor has spent significant time in God's word and in
Days and
communion with
days.
God,
Mhm.
and then is drawing from that deep well to present to their congregation this important message of encouragement, affirmation, challenge, whatever
Right.
it might be.
And
So
or listening to other pastors' sermons on YouTube.
well, that's the problem, is what the pastor brings to their congregation on Sunday isn't really the result of their own deep study of the word and communion with God, then you are making a sacrilege of the sacrament.
Ooh.
And you can't have it both ways. You can't make the sermon sacramental and the centerpiece of worship and then say, well, it doesn't really matter whether or not I really wrote this sermon or someone else. The alternative is diminishing the centrality and importance of the sermon. And therefore, it's not the primary place that people encounter God when they gather on Sunday. And there's less pressure on pastors to create an powerful experience through their sermon, which means they're going to have less temptation to plagiarize or take from someone else's work. So it's immoral no matter when you do it, if you take something that's not yours and pass it as yours. But this is all the byproduct of making the sermon so central and important. And I think that is what's not often being addressed in the stories that are now being written about Sermongate.
Right.
And this is
right.
way more widespread than people realize. This is a huge thing that goes on. It's been around forever. Pastors taking content, and there's whole websites created just to plagiarize sermons as if it's not an issue.
Kaylin, what did you learn in seminary that gives you a perspective on this?
I learned some things in seminary. I don't know. I feel like the thing that, similar to what Sky said, the problem that I have with it is less technical rules about what counts as plagiarism or not, which there's a lot of that going around right now. It's like a sermon's not an academic paper. So like when is it plagiarism? When is it not? I care more about, like Sky said, not just that the sermon is not the most important thing on Sunday morning, but also that the things that we use to judge what a good sermon is not just, this is the best performance I have ever seen. Like if all that matters is like the most like beautifully delivered, captivating, entertaining thing, then like you can listen to a great sermon on a podcast, or like you can watch a YouTube video, or you can read someone's book, and like you might get a better thing than your pastor in your local church. But if there is an actual value on the person who is teaching us the word of God to this particular manifestation of the people of God in this place, in this time in the world, if there's a value to them knowing their people, knowing the particular sins that are their tendencies, knowing their idols, knowing this moment in time for this people, and teaching them the word of God with that in mind, then yeah, it shouldn't be as much of an issue for you to take someone else's stuff, because they're speaking to a different people, maybe at a different time in a different place. So you can learn from them and you can benefit from their study of scripture, but there's a greater value placed on what you are delivering to your people, because there's a less value on performance and delivery and more of a value of, do you know your people well enough to know what they need? Like I have a friend, Sharon Hottie Miller, who's written a bunch of books. She's really brilliant. Her and her husband, Ike, have a church in Raleigh. And he just finished, I think 3 months, she said, of just going to people in their church's houses, listening to them and asking them questions about what they think is wrong in the world, what they want for their church, what they want for their community. And literally, he didn't like talk with them. He just listened to them. And then now is working out stuff in their church from this place of having listened for 3 months to the things that their people need. And that's the kind of thing that, like, I don't care how great a preacher is that you're listening to on your podcast or your YouTube video, they can't be that for your community. And if that was the value we had for a pastor preaching on a Sunday morning, instead of that's the best sermon I've ever heard, then I feel like less pastors would be tempted to just take other stuff as if it was their own, because they'd know that's not the most important thing about a sermon.
Caitlin. That sounds like so much work. To have to talk to all those people? Go to their houses? What if you're not that extroverted? What if you don't, you're just not that wild about people?
If you're not that wild about people, you should not be a pastor.
Okay. Well, let me go at it from a different angle. Okay, that's a point. That's a valid point you're making. What if you love people and you love being a pastor, but you're just not all that spiritually deep? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to create the appearance of spiritual depth with a few simple steps?
That would be, I can see why that would be tempting. Yes.
Okay, here. Hold on a second.
Yes, guy.
Like,
Some pastors, like if you listen to Tim Keller or somebody, is like, wow, he's such a great thinker. I'm not that great a thinker, or I'm not that spiritually mature, but here I am. I'm a pastor. What am I going to do? Can I just kind of modify his sermons?
You're actually touching on something that's really relevant here, Phil, which is in the last however many years with the proliferation. No, really, with the proliferation of digital media and sermons that are online and podcasts and things, people have access to really great preaching all the time. And more pastors, I think, are feeling deeply insecure about their own ability. And part of it is because, as Caitlin points out, we have divorced the sermon from the shepherding of a community, and it's just become a performance art, and people are just judging the performance rather than the relationship behind it. But I think another thing that's unique to the evangelical experience here is we have so desacramentalized everything in the church and individualized it that we've done that to the sermon as well. And here's what I mean. In most evangelical churches, when you go to the communion table or when it's served to you, there's a little piece of bread and a little thimble of juice. And the attitude is there's nothing special about this juice. There's nothing special about this bread. It doesn't matter where it came from or how it ended up in my hands, because it's just a symbol and it's about what I experience of God's presence symbolically through what I'm about to do individually. And I think the sermon operates the same way for a lot of people. They don't care where it came from. They don't care how it was produced. All they care about is, was this sermon helpful to me? And was it meaningful to me? And if that's all that matters, then who cares if the pastor took it from somewhere else, or if he lifted a story or illustration or all of his exegesis from outside of his own or her own work? And I think that's the attitude that has excused a lot of this from a lot of pastors. Like, hey, it's helping people. Who cares? It's fine. And they forget that what's supposed to make the communion table meaningful isn't just the individual's experience of God through some symbol, but it's the people of God gathering at the table across barriers and recognizing that in some transcendent way, the presence of God is here in this special place, in this special moment. Likewise, where a sermon should come from is from a spiritual mother or father deeply communing with God and communing with his word and wrestling with him on behalf of their community, and then stepping forward and saying, here is the message I have from my own wrestling with God and his word for us. That means the origin of that message really matters. It's not just how I hear it or receive it, but we've lost all of that theological and spiritual understanding in most evangelical churches, and it's just a product that gets consumed, and the value is completely rooted in the consumer, not in the production. And that's why we are where we are, and why so many pastors think it's absolutely fine to just take other content and not attribute it. I mean, I borrow content constantly for my sermons and devotionals because I have, shelves and shelves of books and commentaries. I'm not doing all the original theological work myself. I have to rely on scholars for that. But I'm still wrestling with the text. I'm still praying through it. And when I quote somebody, I attribute it to them. I don't say I just came up with this when it was really, Henry Nouwen or Dallas Willard or whatever. So there's so many layers are problematic here. And I think that's why people are having so much difficulty unpacking this story, is because if you really get down to it, you're dismantling the theological assumptions at the root of a lot of American evangelicalism, and people don't want to go there.
Oh boy. You just made that a big thorny mess.
It is a big thorny mess, but it's something I think we should really wrestle with. And I think it's totally fair to ask pastors, tell us how you write your sermons.
Right.
And I don't think it's wrong for a pastor to use outside help or research assistance or what. I mean, that's fine, but I think you have to be transparent about that. And then also talk through, here's my process. of wrestling with God in prayer and study, and here's who I do it with, and here's how it
Mhm.
forms, and be transparent. But this idea that you just emerge on a Sunday morning and you give this amazing performance that everyone cheers at, and that makes you spiritually deep is sad and ridiculous and the epitome of hypocrisy.
Yeah, I've been listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, the new Christianity Today series
Yeah.
done on Mark Driscoll, and that's just an interesting kind of cautionary tale of, well, here's how charisma can go horribly, horribly wrong when we end up with more influence and more celebrity than our young age allows us to handle.
The other thing too about that connects to the Mars Hill story is part of what made that so scary was that you have one person who is like the sage that everything comes
Right.
through, and questioning him is akin to heresy. The beautiful gift of a pastor reading a bunch of people from diverse backgrounds, reading men and women and people of color, and then citing those people in front of their people, is that it not only kind of deflates their authority in a good way of kind of like, I am not the be all end all of people who know what the Bible says, but
Right.
also gives you an opportunity, especially if you're not in a diverse congregation, like if you're in a place in the country where it's just not a diverse area and you're struggling to figure out how to think about diversity in your church. That's such an opportunity that you'd be missing for you to learn from other people, but then not cite it, is to for you to benefit personally, but not for your congregation to see this is the whole people of God and all its diversity, and it is contributing to my own study of scripture. I can't do it by myself, so you shouldn't be studying it by yourself either. It's just such a missed opportunity to bring something really beautiful to your own study, and then also to the way that your people think about your authority and the way that your people think about studying scripture.
Or how about this? I love that idea. But Phil, to your point that the pressure every week for some pastors of producing this content is really hard. What if your pastor got up on a Sunday and was just honest and said, hey, you know what? The last 2 weeks have been really hard, and here's why, and lay it out. I have not had the space, time, or frankly, energy to develop a sermon from scratch because of where I am right now. I want to be honest with you about that. Here's a sermon that I found from, fill in the blank, that really ministered to me this week that I think might speak to many of you. And here's the video, or I'm going to read that person's sermon or whatever. And appreciate the grace you're giving me right now as it's a tough time. I mean, that's assuming you can't invite anyone else into the pulpit that
Right,
week to take
right.
over. But
But
I think
Sky,
that level of honesty and authenticity would be welcomed
Yeah.
rather than stealing a sermon and plagiarizing it as your own to keep up the appearance that you don't have any shortcomings or flaws as a human being.
but Sky, how many
Yeah.
people are going to say, but pastor, this is what we pay you for?
I agree. If a pastor did that every
Yeah.
week, it would probably be a problem. But
Mhm.
if a pastor has built that relational credibility with folks
Right.
and did that once in a while, I think, and if there was a legitimate reason why he or she just couldn't, I mean, sometimes churches, we went through a season a couple years ago where we had just a horrific year of multiple young people tragically dying in our church from, and it was
Mhm.
just, it was a mess. And like at that point, it would not have bothered me one bit if a pastor got up on Sunday and said, hey, listen, what we've been going through the last couple of weeks has taken a toll on the pastoral team. And rather than spend 20 hours writing a sermon, I was with families who are grieving this week. And that kind of
Right.
stuff is completely legitimate. If anything is going to win you more credibility and, and, um, and spiritual.
I guess my question is, how many of us are under the impression that Sunday morning from 10 to 11 is the only thing the pastor is responsible for?
Right.
Yeah.
So if he can't do that, what is
Well,
he doing? So
here is the problem. In some of these
lack
mega
of
churches,
recognition that the job is actually, that pastoring isn't just about preaching.
well, you're right, Phil, but in some of the mega churches that have been pulled into this Sermongate controversy, the pastor is really only preaching.
Mm.
That person doesn't manage the staff. They're not doing pastoral care. They're not visiting families. They are basically there to preach on the weekends. And yet, in some cases, they are outsourcing the research and writing of their sermons to outside groups. So that's where it gets really weird, where your whole job is preaching and you're outsourcing it. Why?
Because I'm speaking at conferences.
Yeah,
to
well, that
to
brings up
to
the other
boost
point of
my
ghostwriting Christian
brand
books.
so I can sell my books. Oh, scary. Okay. All right. What do you think? Come to the website and let us know what you think, and have an awkward conversation with your pastor about how they source their material. That'll be fun for everyone. Okay, new survey out. Interesting results. White mainline Protestants now, for the first time in years, outnumber white evangelicals. And for the first time in years, the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated, as a percentage of Americans, has shrunk. The nuns are shrinking, the mainline is expanding, and evangelicals are also shrinking with the nuns. PRRI, we talked about them last week. It's the group started by Robert P. Jones, the Public Religion Research Institute. Is that what we think
I think that's right.
that means? Finding that religiously unaffiliated Americans, or nuns, have lost ground, making up just 23% of the country. The group peaked at 25.5% of the population in 2018. White Christians, meanwhile, have actually expanded their share of the population, particularly white mainline Protestants. That group sits at 16.4%, up from 13% in 2016, whereas white evangelicals now represent about 14.5% of the population, down from a peak of 23% in 2006. White Catholics, have been holding about the same, 10.9% in 2018, now 11.7%. So since 2006, the percentage of Americans that are white evangelicals has dropped from 23% down to 14.5%. In the last few years, the percentage of white mainline Christians has actually increased. There are more mainline Protestant white Christians than evangelicals. What does it mean, Sky?
Evangelicalism has a problem, and the numbers are
Oh,
finally showing it.
yeah. Because for years, for almost my entire life, the narrative has been, well, the main line is dying because they don't take the Bible seriously. They don't
Right.
take Jesus seriously. They don't take any of this stuff seriously. Evangelicalism is booming because people want to take this stuff seriously. They want either a charismatic experience or a deep, rich biblical experience. And so now the question is, has evangelicalism become so tainted with politics and not taking the Bible seriously, but using it as a bludgeon for political goals, that we're losing a significant amount of people who aren't all becoming nuns because there's fewer nuns than there were 4 or 5 years ago, but may be becoming Methodists and Anglicans and more mainline.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
I think that's a really interesting question, because the narrative that the main line was losing numbers because they didn't take the Bible and faith seriously, maybe that was wrong, maybe it was right, but if it was right, it could explain exactly what's going on with evangelicalism. Is they're kind of a victim, they're falling into the same trap, that they're losing people because they don't take the Bible seriously, because they're not taking Christian faith seriously, and because they've become captivated, in this case, not by cultural pluralism, which was the accusation against the mainliners, but by hyper cultural and political conservatism, which is just falling off the road on the other side.
Right. Okay, here's a really important point, which is worth bringing up. I always wonder when I read anything about, this is evangelicals and this is this group, like, how are you defining that? How are you defining your terms? And so in this study, here's how they defined the terms, because evangelicalism can be defined at least 3 different ways, depending on who the pollster is. If it's Barna, they define it by belief, and they have 8 or 9 key beliefs that make you an evangelical. If it's Gallup, they define it by self-identification. Do you consider yourself an evangelical or born-again Christian? That is, and then if you do, yes, you are an evangelical. There's another group, and Ryan Burge, some of his stuff defines it by your denominational affiliation. Are you a Southern Baptist? Are you in the CMA? Are you, we've got these 10, 20 denominations that we consider evangelical. We've got these, 10 denominations that we consider mainline. So that's what I was wondering if people are switching denominational affiliation, but that's not how this group. That's not how PRRI defines it. They're actually in the Gallup bucket, where they define all respondents who identify as Christian are then asked, would you describe yourself as a born-again or evangelical Christian or not? And if you self-identify as white, non-Hispanic, Protestant, and identify as born-again or evangelical, you're categorized as a white evangelical Protestant. So what's a mainline Protestant? Someone who says no to that question. If you say, no, I don't self-identify as evangelical and I don't self-identify as born again, and born again was a phrase that became very popular in the 1970s around the time of Chuck Colson's autobiography called Born Again. Have you been born again? We had bumper stickers that said, have you been born again? So it's almost a generational thing. So there's a generational aspect to it. We have a very large group of people that said, yes, I've been born again. That's my religious identity. And they were all put in the evangelical bucket. So if you don't have that, if you don't consider yourself, I think I'm evangelical, what is that? Or I'm not sure what the phrase born again means, now you're a mainline Protestant, which means it's a little bit fuzzy what's going on here.
So it could be that there's just a lot of white former people who formerly considered themselves evangelicals who are now turned off by that label and won't self-identify that way anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So you could have Southern Baptists that they're now classifying as mainline Protestants simply because they don't self-identify as evangelical or born again.
Okay, but here's the other part from that survey that I found really eye-opening. They found that there's a larger percentage of Black Americans who identify as evangelical than there are white Americans. So if 35%,
no,
it says,
yes.
evangelicals make up a
yes.
larger portion of Black Americans, 35%, than white Americans, 23%. It doesn't mean there's more Black evangelicals. It means as a percentage, they're more evangelical than white people. And then when you get into the politics of it, this is super crazy. 32% of people in the Democratic Party are Christians of color. Whereas in the GOP, white evangelical Christians only make up 29%.
Right.
So the Democratic Party as a party has more Christians in it.
Non-white Christians.
Right, but it's 32% of the whole party.
Right, is non-white Christians.
But that's
Right,
Christians
that's not counting
versus
white Christians.
evangelicals.
Right.
This is
also,
right.
so it's not apples to apples.
I know, but
there are more non-white Christians in the Democratic Party than there are white evangelicals in the Republican Party.
Exactly.
And that is kind of a stunning thing.
It is when you consider that most people think that white evangelicals have a huge influence on the Republican Party. It makes you wonder, why don't all these Christians of color have a larger influence on the Democratic Party? And when is the Democratic Party going to start realizing that they can't ignore the Christians in their own party?
Right.
So that's ripe for conflict and interesting future dynamics. I think there's a sleeping giant within the Democratic Party of Christians, particularly Christians of color, that if they were to organize properly, could exercise a lot more influence on the Democratic Party than they currently are having.
Right. I'm interested. I would love to see the breakdown for Black Christians, because historically, not a lot of Black Christians have self-identified as evangelical.
Yeah.
So what's the percentage of those that they're counting evangelical that's simply identified as born again? Is born again a common term in traditional Black churches? And is that why so many African Americans in this study are getting classified as evangelical?
Good question. When we have what's his name on, Robert Jones from the
Robert P. Jones?
Yeah, from PRRI, we can ask him those questions.
Caitlin, do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a thought about what Sky said earlier, not to whip us around in a different direction, but the whole idea of younger people, because I do think a lot of this comes down to self-identification based on the way they've done this, of younger people either not calling themselves evangelical or of straight up, I know a lot of people who are in what would be considered an evangelical church that are now in what would really be considered a mainline church. And I am always bothered not only by the whole, they take the Bible more seriously. Obviously that can just kind of be used as a weapon. Like we've used that in ways that don't make any sense. But I do think on some level, even those of us who are uncomfortable with that still kind of think there's the people who have their doctrine right, and then there's the people who treat people well. And the problem I have with that is that it assumes that treating people well has nothing to do with the Bible or with doctrine. Instead of recognizing that I think what a lot of young evangelicals are feeling is not, hey, these people might not take the Bible as seriously, but they treat people well. What they're recognizing is, hey, I was in a tradition that took the Bible real seriously on sexual morality, but not took the Bible real seriously when it came to wealth and poverty and justice. And I want to go to a place where they'll take the Bible very literally and very seriously on those things. And I think we would have a better conversation with young people about the label evangelical and about the types of churches they are in if we just got rid of this who takes the Bible seriously and who doesn't, and had a better conversation about why different cultures, and I don't mean cultures in like an ethnic way, I mean like this little church culture versus this little church culture tends to take certain kinds of verses more seriously than other verses.
Right. Ooh, that's a really good point.
So what you're saying is none of us really take the Bible entirely seriously. We all pick and choose based on our backgrounds.
You know what is such a good example of this? I have a little soapbox about when we talk.
Does it match your little diploma?
Yes. When you make the little Caitlin puppet, I will put it on the little soapbox.
I want the whole play set.
Okay, great. The seminary student playset.
Yes.
I have heard so many sermons that talk about Jesus and the Pharisees in ways that are historically and religiously inaccurate for what the Pharisees were. But one of the problems I really have with it is that we tend to do the same thing with the Pharisees. We'll say the Pharisees took the law really seriously, but they didn't love people well. That ignores the fact that like a ridiculous portion of the Old Testament law is about how you treat people and loving people well. And the reason I think it's so sad that we miss that is because of what Skye just said, that it would be a better illustration of what all humans do, which is look at a bunch of rules or look at, I mean, even now as Christians, we say rules like it's a dirty word, but the New Testament has a lot to tell us about how we should live. We are going to obviously take more seriously the rules that either don't put a burden on us or that make us look good versus the rules that we might have to sacrifice something to keep. That's my soapbox.
Wow. I like that little soapbox. I want to add it to my collection of tiny Caitlin artifacts. Okay. We also just got the Pew research on the 2020 election. And typically right after an election, what you're getting when they say this percentage of this group voted this way, you're getting exit polls. And exit polls are notoriously inaccurate. So what Pew does every election is they do a significant study of verifiable voters that they know voted, that are on the records as having voted, and actually ask them, how did you vote? And it's much more accurate than the exit surveys they do informally as people are walking out of the voting booth. So Pew in 2016 found that 77% of white evangelicals supported Trump. This is interesting. So where did it go in 2020, 4 years later? It went up, and it went up to 84% from 77%. So here's my question, based on what we just read. Since 2006, evangelicals have gone from 23% of the country all the way down to 14% of the country. They've fallen since 2016 as well. So did Trump get a larger share of a smaller pie? And was the pie getting smaller partly because of Donald Trump? Because of people opting out of the brand because they didn't like the association. So when you say, wow, more evangelicals than ever went for Trump in 2020, are you really saying evangelicalism became more and more about Trump in 2020? Thoughts? Discuss amongst yourselves.
Okay. I'm trying to look back on my Twitter feed because I asked that question also, and I think Ryan Burge responded. What?
That's just such a perfect answer. Like,
I don't plagiarize, Skye. I don't plagiarize.
No, I'm not plagiarizing. I'm citing Ryan Burge.
No, you're saying I plagiarized.
No, I'm just saying smart people are asking that same question.
In addition
to
dumb
smart people.
No, I'm saying this is a good.
I'm sorry,
it's a good question.
Skye. There's some way in some way you just insulted me. I can't quite figure it out, but Caitlin's going to figure it out. And she's going to tell me how.
I just thought that, wow, Skye was really prepared to answer your question. He had an expert lined up to help answer your question.
I just found it. Here's what Ryan said on Twitter.
Wait, what did you say? What did you say to Ryan? Give us your version of my question that I then ripped off.
Okay, you didn't rip it off. It's just multiple people are asking the same question. That's all. So
Uh-huh.
I asked on Twitter, could the Pew data be the result of fewer people identifying as evangelical as non-Trump evangelicals abandon the label? The same thing's happening in the Republican Party. As moderates leave the GOP, the percentage of Republicans who support Trump goes up, even as their overall numbers decline, right?
Uh-huh.
So then someone else connected Ryan Burge, and he said this. I've seen people try to explain away the Pew numbers by saying white evangelicals have declined, and that's why this shifted. And he says that's empirically false. The percentage of white people and all people who identify as evangelical went up in 2020. Evangelical numbers are unchanged in 12 years as a percentage of people. So he's saying that the increased support for Trump between 2016 and 2020 is genuinely increased support for Trump among white evangelicals, not that the percentage of people identifying as white evangelicals has declined, and therefore the percentage of them that support Trump has gone up.
And he says the number as a percentage of Americans hasn't decreased in 12 years, he said?
Right.
Okay.
Which
And
he's obviously using a different definition than
the
Pew, I think.
PRRI study says no. Pew, they're not making a statement about that. I was correlating in my capacious brain the numbers from PRRI and the numbers from Pew together in a complex calculation that I call comparing them back and forth.
So you're not breathing out of your butt, you're just talking out of it.
Yes, exactly, which I can do in case of medical emergency. So keep that in mind. So we don't really know. We know that Ryan Burge tends, I believe, to use denominational affiliation for his definition of evangelicalism, where PRRI, Mr. Jones, uses self-identification for his
Right.
definition, similar to Gallup. So fewer people are self-identifying as evangelical, but they are still potentially going to the same denominations that they have been in.
Right.
And
So maybe the big takeaway from all of this is just what we've been saying for years and years and years, which is the label evangelical is losing its cachet, and fewer people want to be identified with it, even if they're not changing any of their beliefs or their denominational or congregational affiliation.
Yeah. Or maybe the big takeaway from this is that we really don't know what we're talking about.
We can't just come right out and say that.
Caitlin, can you help? Caitlin, can you help?
I do think some of the little number shifting on evangelicals voting for Trump is sort of silly. The biggest problem is that a pretty large amount of evangelicals voted for Trump, and a not insignificant number of public evangelical leaders used really bad justifications for voting for Trump. And little shifts in it and how it works, I think it makes perfect sense that there wouldn't be a big shift, or there would be an increase from 2016 to 2020, only because as humans, we love to justify the bad decisions we've already made. we just have this sense of not changing our mind, but also once we have already kind of put ourselves out there in the public square for someone, we feel this bizarre need, Republican or Democrat, to just defend everything they do and to dig our heels in further. And so, at least in my own experience in churches, I think a lot of people, whichever way they decided to vote, it's really unlikely that they end up either changing their mind, hey, that was a bad decision, or that they then turn around and hold the person that they voted for accountable. Those are just not
right.
That's not just an evangelical thing.
Okay, so Pew's, we got to wrap it up, but a few more details from Pew. Their study: white evangelicals increased in support for Trump. White mainline Christians decreased in support for Trump. I find that kind of interesting. So there was something, if you were a mainline Protestant, white Christian, you were more likely to say, I don't like the way this is going with this guy, than if you were an evangelical white Christian. And I'm curious what that is. Maybe it's just a little bit more of a historical focus on justice issues in the main line.
It could just be Biden versus Clinton. Older people that tend to be in mainline denominations have more of a visceral negative reaction to Clinton than they do to Biden.
Good point.
That's totally possible. Another explanation could simply be that in a mainline denomination, there's less stigma on not voting for Trump. So if you change, it's easier to change your mind on Trump because you're not going to be stigmatized by your community, versus if you are in a white evangelical church and you suddenly go, I'm out, I can't do this guy anymore, you're going to face the ridicule of your peers.
Yeah.
Right. And then Black Protestants, because Pew, came up with the data last time, 2016, that 93% of Black Protestants voted for Hillary Clinton, could not vote for Donald Trump. And I had a lot of people just tell me, that can't be true. In the middle of all the race stuff that we were talking about. So I was curious because there was quite a bit of talk that more Black people are supporting Trump in 2020 than in 2016. I was curious whether we would see that when we take out Black Protestants from the overall Black population. And what Pew found is a very slight very slight increase in that 93% voted against Trump in 2016, 91% voted against Trump in 2020. So pretty darn flat.
And what's the margin of error there?
I
Good
don't
question.
know. I'd have to look that up. That could be close to being within the margin of error, I would assume.
Yeah.
Okay, so what have we learned? Jason, can you sing the What Have We Learned song?
You really don't want me to do that.
Okay, that's okay. Caitlin, can you summarize anything from all of this?
Everyone's a mess. We need Jesus.
That was beautiful.
Thank
Sky,
you.
do we have a guest?
Yeah, I'm assuming.
Wonderful. Oh, your enthusiasm fills me with joy.
Well, it's hard to get excited when we
Okay.
haven't recorded the guest yet, so I don't know.
Hope it's
Thanks, everybody, for coming along, listening in. Thanks for the support on Patreon. If you want bonuses and extras and behind the scenes stuff, go to patreon.com/holy post and check it out. And we will see you next week. Bye, guys.
I visit a lot of college campuses, or at least I did before COVID, and I engage with a lot of young people who are very animated to combat the evils that they see in the world, like racism, poverty, human trafficking, and any number of other social ills. And while I applaud their desire to make the world a better place, I'm struck by how their desire for justice is incompatible with their vision of a God who is never angry and never wrathful. If God never gets angry, then how can he really care about all the things that are broken in the world? This is what we're wrestling with right now in With God Daily. Throughout the summer, we've been doing a series about what the Bible has to say about justice, and now we're transitioning into how that fits with God's anger and wrath. Topics which are really out of favor right now in the American church, and yet are really important if we believe that this world needs to be set right from all that's wrong. If these are the kind of issues you're wrestling with and want to come to a richer, fuller, theologically deep, and biblically faithful response, then I encourage you to sign up for With God Daily, the daily devotional I write for people who hate daily devotionals. If you go to withgoddaily.com, you can learn more about how to sign up not only for the daily email, but also get the mobile app and the audio version of the devotional. We have a lot of changes coming soon to With God Daily, so now's a great time to get in and learn more about it. Again, it's at withgoddaily.com. It's a sad fact today that sexual abuse scandals are all too common in the church. We often encounter headlines about a new church leader being embroiled in one of these scandals, sometimes a parachurch organization or outreach ministry, and sometimes even entire denominations that are either hiding or deflecting from the true scope of sexual abuse within their ranks. Our guest today is Mary DeMuth. She's the author of over 40 books and has become a strong advocate for survivors of sexual abuse within the church because she's a survivor herself. Her latest book on this topic came out in 2019 called We Too: How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis. In my conversation with her, I didn't want to dive into the specifics of certain scandals, but instead take a step back and look at the bigger picture of how sexual abuse happens in so many different churches, the history of this phenomenon, and why cover-ups are becoming so commonplace, especially within evangelical ministries. And then what can we do about it? How do we respond better? And how do we put things in place which actually can prevent this kind of abuse from happening in the first place? This topic and our conversation is both heartbreaking and encouraging because there are things we can do to better care for the people in our midst who've been harmed by sexual abuse and concrete steps we can take to improve on the record of the church in the future. Here is my conversation with Mary DeMuth. Mary DeMuth, welcome to the Holy Post.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I am a huge fan and super excited to be here.
Thanks for saying that. We tried starting this a few minutes ago and our recording system completely erupted on us. So we're starting over, but it's okay. We didn't get too far in. But you were talking about the SBC last month and some of the developments that were encouraging to you on this issue of abuse within the church. So for my sake, repeat it again, and for everyone's sake, kind of what happened at the SBC that you were encouraged by?
Right. So I didn't attend this time. I was there a couple years ago, but I was watching it very closely. And one of the things that was encouraging was a very close vote to elect Ed Litton for the president of the SBC. And he has a lot of empathy toward both racial reconciliation issues as well as sexual abuse and how to do that better within the church. And there was a lot of grassroots stuff going on from the floor. I don't have all of the exact uh, verbiage of what was said, but there was definitely some folks who are talking about we need to deal with this issue, and we also need to deal with looking into the executive committee and how they have dealt with issues of sexual abuse in the past. And they were tasked with looking at churches that the credentials committee was looking at churches that had not done a good job with sexual abuse and how they have reported it and things like that. And there was just some wonky things that had gone on in the past year that needed to be looked at. And so one of the resolutions that was passed quite handily or heartily was looking at the executive community with an independent investigation.
And one of the things that motivated that was a letter that leaked out or an email that leaked out shortly before the convention from Russell Moore, where he outlined the
Yeah.
I don't even know how to describe it. It was so dramatic, but he outlined the resistance that he experienced in trying to be an advocate for victims of abuse in the church, and ways in which he thought that some of the leadership within the SBC were neglecting or trying to minimize this issue. Talk about the impact that his leadership and his letter had on what you saw with the convention last month.
I think it had a huge impact, and you couple that with Philip Bethancourt and some of the things that he wrote as well. You see this overall picture of something that's been going on in the universal church for until now, like forever, which is we value our reputation far more than we value the cries of the broken. And it was very easy for the Protestant church to point the finger at the Catholic Church and be self-righteous and say, that doesn't happen in our camp. But that's not true. It did happen in our camp. We were just maybe better at covering it up, or because of our structures that were different than the Catholic Church, they were hard to pinpoint. But as we saw within the Houston Chronicle article, the Baptist church was doing the exact same thing as the Catholic church. They were just bumping people to the next location without any, recourse, nothing. And so what Russell Moore had to say, to get back to your question, had a lot to do, I think, with how the outrage quotient of the folks there just saying this really has to stop. This is not what Jesus would do. And when I get back to this issue, that's where I go. I go to Jesus. I think to myself, if a sexual abuse victim came to Jesus and said, I've been abused by someone, what would he do? Would he cover it up, or would he do something about it? And it just seems so simple to me, and I don't understand why folks don't get it.
When you talk about something as grievous as sexual abuse and respond with something as simple as WWJD,
Yes.
it does kind of show the clarity that's necessary in this moment, and makes you wonder why we struggle so much with that call. Back up for a second, though. You briefly mentioned some history, and in your book, We Too, you have an interesting section on the history of this issue within the church. I think some people might be under the illusion that this is a modern or contemporary problem. Obviously, there's nothing new about sexual abuse. It's as old as humanity. You see it throughout the scriptures. You see it throughout history. Talk about some of what you learned in your research for your book about the history of this topic and how the church had dealt with it in the past.
Yeah, so definitely, I was surprised, as many are, that this has actually been talked about in the past. And within the Catholic Church. And what would happen was they would have these kind of cyclical things, kind of like the cycle of Judges, where you would have sexual abuse happen typically with priests, and someone would rise up and say, this shouldn't be happening. And I found it fascinating that we had one of these cycles happen, and then the Reformation happened. And what happened at the Reformation was that the Catholic Church began to circle its wagons. They were like, we can't lose people again. And so all those good voices for reform got crushed or silenced or dismissed. And that was kind of when the secrecy began. And oddly, that same DNA about secrecy and sexual abuse made its way into the Protestant church as well. And so this circling the wagons has been as old as time. And one of my chapters in there, of course, is walking through the whole scripture about sexual abuse throughout the whole Old and New Testament. It's there. So like you said, it's an age-old problem, and the question becomes, what will we do about it? So when I went to the Caring Well conference and I had the opportunity to speak there, I looked around the room. I think there were about 3,000 people there, and I started to cry because I thought, I wonder if this is the largest gathering of Christ followers in the history of the church to address sexual abuse in the church. And it felt like that could be true.
Well, I wonder if that's one of the reasons why these motions and the election of Dr. Litton at the SBC were successful. There were other issues that were kind of percolating around the SBC, around politics, around race, around CRT, Donald Trump, and some of these other matters. But there are just so many people who have been either directly or tangentially affected by sexual abuse in the church. There are so many victims, so many families that have been impacted by this. The sheer numbers made it the most pressing issue for so many people that it eclipsed many of the others. And there's something to be encouraged by that more people are stepping forward and caring about this. There's also something deeply troubling about it, to realize how ubiquitous it is and how it always has been throughout church history. Okay, let me go back to something you mentioned, which I think we need to look at more carefully. That the Roman Catholic Church had a sort of cyclical way of dealing with this. And then the Reformation happens and it circles the wagons, to use your language, to protect itself. And then the Protestant church has kind of followed that model for the last 500 years. It seems like what changed there was the introduction of competition, that people now had a choice. And of course, in the United States, under the First Amendment, freedom of religion, people have a choice. Church is a voluntary organization that people can choose to be a part of or choose to be not a part of, or part of a different one. And the moment you introduce choice into the marketplace, you introduce the incentive for these institutions to protect themselves, to hide things that are undesirable to a religious consumer. How do you see that manifesting itself in the American church, in the way they respond, or leaders, the way they respond to allegations of sexual abuse?
Well, I wish that it didn't have to do with money, but I kind of think that it does. Because if you lose your constituency, you also lose your power, and you also lose your financial backing. And so you protect the institution for the sake of that. Um, having done a lot of reading lately and just really have appreciated your posts on Jesus and John Wayne, but this kind of idea of, what the mega church, how that came about and who's leading those churches and all of that, I think it corresponds to that kind of a hyper consumerism in the American church, at least. And so, yes, we can shop for the church that we want, and we have power now in that sense, as we can. A mega church can move from one place to another. Your membership can leave you, and so I agree with you. I think that does have something to do with the protection of reputation. We see that with Ravi Zacharias as well. That was an entirely large organization, and it had so many people employed by it that this secret would have destroyed it, and it did destroy it.
Well, it seems to match over the last 20 some years that I've been involved in ministry circles. and going back probably to the 1980s, we've seen the influence of corporate American
Mm.
structures on the church, right? We emulate what we see in corporations. We even bring in secular corporate leaders to speak to pastors about great leadership principles. And American corporations have a pretty nasty history of hiding things like faulty products and environmental destruction and all kinds of other financial shenanigans. I'm thinking of Enron. And I mean, the
Mhm.
whole financial collapse back in 2007, 2008 was basically corporations and their leaders behaving badly. But the incentive structure is always to hide those things, to keep things moving, to keep the profits coming. And it makes sense to me that if we're going to emulate those entities in the church, that you would see the same cover up mentality exist within the church. Only sadly, we're covering up the abuse of victims rather than just a faulty product. Let's talk about prevention a little bit. And we'll talk about how we ought to respond to allegations when they arise later. But I don't think we hear enough about prevention. I mean, as much as this is a ubiquitous problem that's always been there and to some degree always will until Christ returns, what are some things you've learned that we can do, whether individually or as churches, that can mitigate the likelihood of more sexual abuse victims in our churches?
One is to speak frankly about sex with our kids. And to one of the things that I learned in one of the books that I wrote about parenting was that kids in highly structured, very domineering type structures of family, uh, when they went to college, they were, I think it was like 6 times more likely to be seduced by a cult leader, because they have been in a structure where they have always had to submit to their parents, and they also have a lot of naivete. And so in terms of childhood sexual abuse, having frank conversations about sex is very important. I also would say that in church, we need to normalize this, not to make it comfortable, to keep it uncomfortable. But honestly, and this is one of the things that really frustrates me as an advocate and a speaker, writer, all that stuff, is that I can count on one hand how many times I've heard about sexual abuse from the pulpit of a church, and that was me doing it. And so I feel like, and I know I've talked to many pastors, and I know that they're very reticent about speaking about it because they will say to me, I don't want to open that can of worms. I don't have the expertise to be able to shepherd people through that. And to that, I say, isn't that what we're supposed to do as shepherds of the flock? Isn't that what we're supposed to love the broken? We're supposed to be like Jesus and go to the margins. And so my encouragement to pastors is talk about it, have some systems in place, some Stevens ministers, a list of resources and community resources that you can send your folks to, but don't be afraid of talking about it frankly. When, I felt like, as a sexual abuse victim, I felt like I was a freak for years and years and years, um, because I thought I was the only one with my story. For some reason, I thought there was like this magical thing that happened at the door of church, and that when I walked through, the statistics were different, and that it wasn't so many people that had been affected. But I started speaking about this issue in the 90s, and every single time I did, there was a lot of uncomfortable church leaders and a huge line of people coming up. I thought I was the only one. 75-year-old women coming up to me saying, this is the first time I've talked about it. And we have to normalize it. We have to talk about it.
Oh gosh, yeah, we do. Having been a local church pastor, I don't want to excuse the silence, but I understand it.
Sure, sure.
Again, going back to the model that I was given, and I think most pastors have been given, at least in evangelical America, you're running a corporation. You're running an organization that is designed to accomplish some mission. And I can't think of an organization or mission-minded institution in America that says, yeah, we want a bunch of broken, hurting, abused people to accomplish this work, right? You want people who are engaged and motivated and activated and high capacity. And so when a pastor steps into a pulpit and says, hey, let's talk about the ubiquitous nature of abuse among us all, and have people open up about their baggage and the wounds that they carry, that's in their minds going to slow down the mission, right? It's a distraction from the work that we want to get done. And what you're simply reminding us of is, no, that is the mission. That is what we're called to do. And so I think at a deeper level, I think many of us in church leadership need to just have our vision of what our calling is transformed from a corporate leader to a shepherd again. And then in the shepherding model, what you're advocating for makes sense, but in the corporate leader model, it's a distraction, and I don't want to waste my time with it.
Well, exactly. And I have found a lot of people who have been traumatized by various things have kind of learned to cover up themselves, of just like, well, I know that I'm in this church and I know that my value is what I produce. Therefore, I'm going to stuff all of this
Right.
trauma in order to, and a lot of it, like me, I'm one of those positive rebellers. So I'm going to do all the things, to make sure I'm approved and be loved by all the leaders. And so that's my kind of positive or negative coping mechanism of dealing with my trauma. But that doesn't necessarily deal with the deeper issues of the heart. And that, I think, is where we're forgetting the first century model of church, of people gathering in homes and bearing one another's burdens and thus fulfilling the law of Christ. And I would also advocate that as a survivor and one who's walked through trauma and kind of come through on the other side, not fully, but pretty far, we need folks like me. We need broken folks who understand that Christianity is never about me being cool for Jesus and me getting it all together for Jesus. It's about my weakness married to his strength. I think we've created in America, we've created this culture of kind of cavalier, just bootstrap your way up. And you know what? God cannot get in a word in edgewise with someone who's full of themselves. But he, married to the weakness of a believer, can do astounding things. And I would say, and this is one thing I would say to pastors today, instead of viewing sexual abuse victims as a negative on your bottom line, view them as who they really are. They are your tutors to lead you to the heart of Christ. They are your tutors to teach you how to shepherd the broken. They are valuable. The things that we deem not valuable are actually the things that God deems valuable.
Amen. Oh, as you were sharing that, what came to mind was Henry Nouwen's term, the wounded healer. Right? And you see that again and again in Scripture, Jesus himself being the most obvious. But the story of Jacob wrestling with God and walking with a limp thereafter, we would see that limp as an impediment. But in truth, it was a sign of his humility and his brokenness before the Lord. And only after that could he really carry the blessing of the Lord forward. So rather than looking at the people who are limping in our churches as slowing us down, like you said, we ought to see them as that's where we find the power of Christ. On this topic of prevention, what about preventing abusers in the first place? How do we spot or identify or screen out potential leaders who may have a tendency or the proclivity to abuse? Have you come across anything that's effective in that front, or is it one of those things where you're just going to have to deal with it after it manifests its ugly head?
Well, sadly, Chuck DeGroat wrote a book about narcissism in the church and narcissistic leaders, and that tends to be one of the issues. So there's kind of two different issues going on. There's the kind of the Bill Hybels narcissistic, kind of power hungry. I have power, therefore I can harm others. And then there's pedophiles, and those folks can have a trail of evidence, but not always. And that's where we have to go beyond a robust background check, because so many times those they're not legally there's no trail of what they've done. And so you're right. It is hard to prevent, but I think in terms of senior leaders, we can give really good tests. I know Dr. McKnight has talked about doing stronger personality tests and trying to evaluate narcissistic leaders, because they tend to be more of those who abuse. And then there are some other assessments out there that will help you determine pedophilic leaders as well. So I think we need to rely on the wisdom of the world in this sense of what counseling and psychology has helped us to determine. And also, of course, praying and checking your gut and all of those things are very, very important. But there's also some expertise out there that we can tap into.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering, as horrible and criminal as sexual abuse is, it's one form of abuse. And there are bad leaders out there, narcissistic leaders who abuse in a number of other ways, which may not be technically criminal, but are certainly ungodly. And none of that deserves a pass. But it's sad that sometimes it has to cross a criminal line or a sexual abuse line before it gets our attention. And it often manifests itself in other ways long before that. Talk about structures a little bit. I think you mentioned earlier how when the Roman Catholic Church was going through its turmoil in the last 10, 15 years, where all the stories were coming out, there was a level of smugness, frankly, on the part of some Protestant churches or evangelical churches, saying, "Well, that just shows you how the Catholic hierarchy is ripe with abuse and corruption, and we're immune from that because we're a congregational church, or we're a Baptist church, or whatever the thing might be." Um, what do you look for in a church that has a healthy leadership structure that's able to either prevent these abuses from happening or at least respond to them in a healthy way when they arise?
Well, I like to see that there are advocates or people who have been through some sort of trauma on those leadership teams. I like to see women on those leadership teams as well. I also like to see that they're not just a puppet team, but an actual team. You see, right now with Mark Driscoll and his other church, his new church, he doesn't really have a system of accountability anymore, and that to me is a huge red flag. So one of the things I look for, and I've been at my church for a really long time, and it's a gigantic church. But they have a board of elders. My husband served on that board for 5 years, and we were scared when he got on because we were afraid he's going to know all the stuff, and then we're not going to want to come to this church anymore. But it was very encouraging to see the interaction that went on within that space. And so I think those are questions you can ask, is to ask what kind of, whatever structure that is, whether it's elders or deacons or congregational led or however it is, to find out if there are people who have an empathetic bent toward the broken. I think that really does help.
That's critically important. The other piece, though, I mean, we all know stories of churches that technically had accountability structures, whether it was an elder
Sure.
board or a governing board or a bishop or hierarchy of some kind, and yet abuse not only happened in those places but was covered up or in some way not mishandled because there wasn't the ability to actually confront the senior pastor or confront the leader. So you may have the structure, but if it's populated with people that don't have the relational strength to be the Nathan who confronts the David, like what is that? How do you know if your church has that kind of capacity? I mean, you can look at the structure on paper and go, yeah, this looks good. But is it just kind of a kabuki theater thing where it's all for show and it's not really substantive?
It's really hard. I mean, that's the $1 million question, because unless, especially in these larger churches, unless you're close to that leadership structure, it's almost impossible to find out how that actually operates on a day-to-day basis. For me, I had that opportunity as, being married to someone on that board. I knew how that operated. And so I think that's kind of in the granular place of when you're joining a church and they share, kind of their structure, to really be one who asks a lot of questions. And I think the other thing that's unfortunate in all of that is what we've kind of already gotten back to, is this kind of consumer-based, quote unquote, Christianity that is about running a business more than it is about shepherding a body. And so if you are in that kind of situation, maybe it could be time to change to that smaller place where more can happen. But then, I've been in structures too where it's been a small, tiny church and it's been an abusive church. So gosh, it's really hard. And the question becomes, how do we live and move and exist within that? How do we become an advocate within that system and have a voice? And and how do we encourage the kind of leadership that there is no one man or one woman who could take the whole thing down? I think that's another issue that we could talk about as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, and we had Scott McKnight on a couple months ago to talk about his book and all the
Mhm.
research he did about abusive structures and cultures within churches. And I'm glad you bring out the point. There's so much attention lately on abusive megachurches, and we can come away from those stories and romanticize, well, a small church or a house church is going to avoid all those
Yeah.
problems, and yet it'll manifest itself differently. So there isn't a silver bullet structure here, but maybe we just need to be more aware of whatever system we're in. Where are the unique opportunities for that structure to fail us, and how do we mitigate against it? Okay, talk about. I mean, you've been an advocate in this area for a long time. You've heard a lot of stories. You've dealt with a lot of churches. What are common mistakes that you see leaders make or churches make when an allegation of abuse comes forward?
The first response is typically, and usually there's a lot of lawyers on those leadership teams, just FYI, I found that out through the years, is to consult about that, about how do we protect our reputation. Um, there was a guy in Houston who, his name's Nathan Leno, and he found out about an abuse allegation in his Southern Baptist church, and he dealt with it head on. So he called a press conference, which I think is, gutsy. And he said, "This happened on our watch. The first thing we did was we reported it, and the person's been fired. And they also provided counseling for the victim for the rest of her life." And she ended up marrying a church leader, which is a huge, as you can imagine, that would be a hard thing to do if that was your abuse, what happened to you as a young person. But he did the opposite of what most do. So most, as we've said, these words circle the wagons, most look first to look at their reputation, or they question the abuse victim and ask them these questions that basically are saying, "Are you sure it really happened?" And we see a
Right.
lot of that kind of like blaming of the victim, or they think that they're some sort of investigator, even though they're a pastor of a church and they've never been trained in this kind of thing. And they just think, well, I'll get both of them in the room and we'll hash this out because, Jesus covers a multitude of sins. And if he confesses or she confesses, then that person can forgive very quickly. And we can just go on because the gospel's great and grace is awesome. Well, none of that is helpful to a sexual abuse survivor. In fact, that is way more traumatizing. And that is not a response that we should have.
Okay, so I'm trying to again put myself in the shoes of a church leader, and somebody comes to me with an accusation of abuse by someone else, perhaps another pastor or something. I want to believe that my gut is going to be to side with the survivor, to advocate for their healing and well-being and all that. I have to confess, there's a part of me that wants to say, okay, if this is true, it's going to destroy this other the abuser's life, career, ministry. All of that is gone. So there's a hesitancy to say, okay, I really need to be sure that this is accurate, because what's at risk here is huge. On the flip side, if you don't take it seriously, what's at risk here is that survivors' well-being and their faith and everything. So you have these monumentally big consequences on either side. And I can understand why pastors kind of freeze and they're not sure what to do in these situations. So um, how do you counsel somebody in that moment to not get frozen or not default to circle the wagons kind of mindset? Um, One thing that comes to my mind is I don't want to be the only person who knows what's going on.
Right.
So I would want to bring someone else in immediately to make sure I'm not delusional in my thinking or decision making there. And I think a lot of these stories end up in trouble when it's only one person who knows what's going on, and then they bury it or they're frozen by it. Not to. How have you seen other pastors react well, or church leaders react well, other than the, let's call it, press conference, which is amazing, but
Whoa.
probably not the norm.
Yes.
So what do you counsel church leaders to do?
Okay, there's two different ways. So the first is if the person is a minor that comes to you, everything's off the table. You go directly to the authorities, and there is no other decision to be made. That's the first decision. You have to do that. If it's not a minor, then one of the things I think Dr. McKnight talked about was having a listening committee. And this is a committee built with people who have deep empathy, who have been through trauma, and it's both men and women, people of color, just a wide spectrum. And having them present with you or separately from you to listen to that is really helpful. And then the other step I would say is to have in your back pocket, and this is where being proactive comes in, to have in your back pocket a connection with some entity that does independent investigations, because you are not equipped to discern this. We have to remember that sexual predators are very good at getting away with it. In fact, my friend Jimmy Hinton, his father was the pastor of his church, and then he ended up pastoring the church. His father abused hundreds of little girls, and nobody knew. And Jimmy ended up turning in his father when he found out. And he has a book about it. It's an amazing story. And that's hard because he knew he was going to probably lose his church. It was his father's church. But what he learned from his father, and this is what I wanted to kind of hone in on, what he learned from his father is he started to go to the prison to visit his dad because he felt like his mission in life was to try, as terrible as it sounds, to understand the mind of a predator. And what he learned was that predators are not about, oh, I have this situation, I'm going to take advantage of it, or, oh, I'm going to groom this child. Their job 100% of the time is thinking about how they can get away with it. And they are constantly testing. And part of their MO is to be an upstanding religious leader in a community so that no one will ever believe them. That's why an independent investigation is essential, because you have that connection with that leader. You don't have editorial distance from it. You need somebody else.
Okay, I'm glad you bring that up because there have been some high-profile stories in recent years where churches, and I'm using air quotes, hire an independent investigator.
Right.
And in some cases, it turns out it's really not that independent. So talk about the difference between a true independent investigator and what sometimes gets presented that way.
Right. And so if that independent investigation is somehow tied, whether financially or, that's someone that somebody knows within the church structure, those can be okay. But it's always better to hire kind of a degree or two of separation away. So I know that netgrace.org, which is the ministry that Boz Chivijan founded. He's no longer head of it, but they do those kinds of independent investigations. And what they do in those is they actually interview people who have been harmed. One of the things I see in these quote independent investigations is a lot of times I've talked to survivors who said, I've never been talked to. My story has never been told. And so what they will do in those kind of one-sided investigations is talk to only the leaders or the people who have a stake in the reputation of the institution versus actually talking to the victims.
Okay, last question here. And this, I've been debating how to phrase this because I know it can sound really insensitive in the way I'm going to ask this, but I think it's important. We've talked about mistakes that leaders make when these accusations come forward. What are mistakes that survivors make? And what I mean by that is not mistake as if they caused their abuse by any means, but mistakes they make after the abuse in how they do or don't tell their story, or who they decide to tell that story to, or where they go with it. You've dealt with a lot of survivors. You're a survivor yourself. What wisdom have you gained from that when you talk to somebody and you warn them, hey, listen, here's what not to do, that too many survivors do that ends up worsening the pain?
This is one of the things I worried about when the Me Too hashtag came out, and my heart started breaking because while I was grateful and while I often tell audiences an untold story never heals, it is not best told in the public sphere. And so if your first time that you've shared is with a hashtag and now your family suddenly knows that you're a sexual abuse victim, it can shortchange your healing journey. And thankfully, when I shared for the first time, there was no social media because I'm old. But I still had that issue where I was an oversharer for a period of time in my high school and college years because I was so desperate. Once I told the story, there was kind of this addiction of I need to be validated. I need to know that this is bad. I need to hear someone's empathy, and it kind of shortchanged me. And so the other thing that I see is, first of all, find a safe person to share that with.
Define a safe person.
Not Twitter. A safe person
Twitter,
is not
right.
Twitter, yeah, not Instagram. A safe person is someone who has proven themselves trustworthy, who keeps confidence over the years. And it's usually not the flashy person. It's usually that staid, kind of gentle, shepherdy kind of friend who has been with you through thick and thin. And so having that safe person is really helpful. The other thing that I've seen, and I might get in trouble for this, but one of the things I've seen that's been harmful is I see people who share their story and immediately become an advocate. And I have a friend who did that and now has had to pull completely away from social media because her counselor says you cannot be on for a year, basically, or for a certain amount of time, because it's so damaging, because people are vicious and their tendency for whatever reason is to attack the victim. It's not to attack the structure or the person who did it. Their tendency is to say, you are doing Satan's work. And that, if you're in the position of trying to heal, is devastating. And so for people like me, I was abused at 5. I talked about it at 15. I've spent years, decades healing, and I've got a very strong editorial distance between the abuse and now. And I can be a very strong advocate, but even me, who's been doing this for a long time, it's still hard to be criticized. It's still hard to be called Satan's minion. So those are my couple of cautions.
Well, I'm grateful to hear that. I mean, my question and your advice is never obviously meant to victim shame in any way, but to learn from the experience of other survivors what actually helps bring healing best, and avoiding things that either slow down or reverse the progress of healing that can happen. And I don't know if my father taught me this directly or indirectly, but when I was a kid, I remember him teaching me essentially the most important things in life are the least visible,
Mm.
right? They're the things that aren't shared with the world. And so when it comes to social media, I know there are some personality types that just want to put it all out there all the time and think that healing will come through that transparency. And I've never experienced that myself. I've never believed it. But if we do need that deep healing and deep affirmation, it's going to come through those safe people and relationships, not through the mob on social media, even the positive mob that exalts you and says you're wonderful for what you're doing. Mary, point us in the direction of resources. I mean, you have your book, We Too. You also have a website, we2.org. But what are some of the best resources that you've been able to curate there that you want to point people to?
Yeah. So when I talked about pastors saying, I don't want to preach about this because I don't know where to send people, there's on we2.org/resources, there's international resources for all over the world about how to help, both from a faith perspective and just people who are experts in that area. So I've got hundreds that I've curated. There's also a 21-day email healing sequence, and you can go to we2.org/21 days and receive an email a day about my best practices that I've learned over the years of healing. And I've had such great testimonies from people who have really begun their journey of healing just through that very tender process of quietness in their own space, not loud on social media. And netgrace.org is an amazing resource for churches who are trying to navigate sexual abuse and how to do that well as Scott McKnight's book, The Church Called Tove, really great resource as well.
Yeah, I agree completely. Mary, thank you so much for your time today and for your tireless work on this topic, which touches every church, every family, and far too many people. And I do really, really hope that what's happened in the SBC will be a wake-up call to other churches and denominations that they need to be talking about this rather than burying it. And hopefully we do see growth and healing throughout the church on this topic again. So, Mary, thank you for being an advocate for that and helping us all see things more clearly.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.